We've spent a lot of time on this channel looking at what institutional Christianity built, like the councils, the creeds, and the various philosophical frameworks imported from Greece and Rome and then imposed on a text that never asked for them. That work has all been documented, it's all grounded in mainstream non-LDS scholarship, and we're not going back to relitigate any of that here. We're moving on. What I want to do today is go further back, past the councils, past the creeds, and past the canon debates, back to the oldest recoverable religious material that we have, and then look honestly at what that material says when you compare it side by side across multiple ancient traditions at the same time. Before we get into it, just a few things as always. The academic sources in this episode are drawn primarily from outside the LDS tradition. Many of them are outside of Christianity and religion altogether. People like Egyptologists, Assyriologists, historians of religion, comparative linguists, and classical scholars working at institutions like Oxford, Harvard, the University of Chicago, the University of London, and the Collège de France. People like Thorkild Jacobson, Mircea Eliade, Walter Burkert, Jan Assmann, Mary Boyce, and Andrew George, all simply working from the ancient textual and archaeological record without any stake in what conclusions I draw from it. I'm purposely not citing scholars who set out to confirm the restoration. I'm citing scholars who set out to understand ancient civilization and whose findings keep landing in the same spot. If you're curious, all of the sources for today are in the pinned comment. Now, this episode is also a little bit more personal than most. A big part of what I'm going to describe is the intellectual trail that I personally followed for roughly 15 years before I had any interest in the LDS Church. I was not raised to believe these things, and I was not looking for a church of any kind. I was just following threads that kept showing up completely uninvited across ancient traditions, like the Sumerian tablets, the Egyptian texts, Zoroastrian cosmology, and Indo-European mythology. I noticed that certain structural elements kept appearing in traditions that shouldn't have been in contact with each other, and eventually ran out of secular explanations for what the pattern was showing me. Now, some of the reading I did early on was not exactly peer-reviewed, and I fully acknowledge that with all the humor that it deserves when we get there. But remember that as a member of the church, we delight in all truth, regardless of the credentials attached to it. One more thing about the scope as well. This episode is not exhaustive, point blank. The scholars and traditions I covered today are representative but not comprehensive. There is so much more evidence pointing in the same direction than a single video could or should cover. But like I said before, the pinned comment will take you further. And finally, thank you again and always for the enormous amount of support that I've received. You've all made this channel what it is and what it's becoming, and I will continue to look for more and better ways to get these videos and this information out in more digestible forms. If you would like to contribute to what I'm doing, please consider donating to my Ko-Fi or PayPal, but if you really want to help, just like the video and share it with someone that could use this information. So, without further ado, I'm Alex Arnold, and this is Moroni Standard. So when we say these ancient stories are myths, what are we actually saying? And where does a serious investigation into all of this actually begin? Let's start by unpacking what the word myth means before we go any further. In casual usage, myth is essentially used as a synonym for false, just a story invented by ignorant people before science arrived to sort everything out. But that's not what the academic study of mythology actually concludes. Scholars who have spent their careers on this material, people like Mircea Eliade, the Romanian historian of religion who held the chair at the University of Chicago for nearly 3 decades, and Walter Burkert, the Swiss classical scholar who did foundational work on Greek and Near Eastern religious traditions, understood myth as something considerably more substantive. For Eliade, myths are preserved memory of what happened at the foundation of the world, which religious rituals then reenacts. For Burkert, myths transmit cultural memory across timescales that written history simply cannot reach. And just as a side note, neither of these men was religious in any conventional sense. They were just historians describing what the evidence shows. The definition of myth matters because it determines what we do with the similarities. That being said, preserved memory alone doesn't automatically get you to shared source. Two traditions could definitely independently preserve memories of different events that happen to resemble each other. What turns the preserved memory framework into an evidential argument is the specificity. When multiple traditions don't just share similar themes, but actually preserve identical structural mechanisms with identical theological functions, then the most parsimonious explanation is that they're remembering the same events and the same theological architecture. That's the argument today. But to understand why that argument works, we're going to start where I started. The oldest written religious texts that we have come from ancient Mesopotamia. The Sumerians were producing religious material by around 2600 BC, although the traditions that those texts encode are considerably older than the actual writing itself. Anyway, later as political power shifted to Babylon, those same Sumerian traditions were absorbed and synthesized into new literature. Among the most significant of the Babylonian texts is the Enuma Elish, a creation epic composed in Akkadian, which is a Semitic language closely related to Hebrew. It draws on the older Sumerian framework with a cosmic divine council deliberating before creation, a primordial chaos preceding the ordered world, creation by divine decree, and humanity fashioned from a mixture of divine and earthly material. Now, when I first came across the Enuma Elish, it was through a weird rabbit hole, which I will not be elaborating on further. But suffice it to say that some of my original frameworks did not survive contact with any actual scholarship. But regardless, even through that interpretive fog, the shape of the story still felt familiar. A divine assembly, creation from pre-existing material, and humanity carrying divine substance. Now, I want to be clear about why this matters, because calling this a loose thematic similarity is an easy dismissal. The issue is not that both traditions involve gods or creation, because any number of traditions share those general features. The real issue is that both present those three elements in the same cosmological sequence and in the same exact theological relationship, which consists of a divine assembly that deliberates and governs, creation from organized pre-existing material, and a humanity that carries divine substance as an actual constitutive element of its nature, and not simply as a nice metaphor. So that specific combination in that sequence, appearing in both the oldest Babylonian texts and the Hebrew Bible, and even more traditions as I would later learn, is what raises the question about where both traditions were actually drawing from. Thorkild Jacobson, one of the foundational figures of modern Assyriology at Harvard and the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, spent decades documenting these structural parallels between Mesopotamian and early Hebrew religious concepts, not making theological arguments or anything, but just describing what the texts actually say. And what they say is that ancient Israel did not develop its theological categories in isolation. Now, the standard response to that observation is that Israel simply borrowed from Mesopotamia, and cultural contact between Israel and Mesopotamia is well documented. So, some degree of borrowing really happened, and it's acknowledged by mainstream scholars. But borrowing only explains surface-level cultural exchange. It still doesn't explain why the specific theological architecture appears not only in Mesopotamia and Israel, but across traditions with no plausible contact with either of them. If the explanation were simply borrowing, then the architecture would be confined to only the contact routes. Well, you guessed it, it's not. And that kind of distribution is what typically points towards something older than any of the traditions currently drawing from it. So then, what are all of the specific recurring structural elements that keep coming up across these traditions, and why can't they simply be explained as independent human invention? To start here, I should tell you that my method wasn't at all methodical. It was more like I was running into the same stranger in multiple different cities. You wouldn't conclude that there was a pattern after the first time, but by the fourth or fifth time, you wouldn't be calling it a coincidence anymore. For me, the threads came fast and often simultaneously, but looking back, 5 elements kept surfacing regardless of which tradition I was in. And the question of why they keep surfacing together is inseparable from describing what they actually are. So let me address both things at once. The first element is the divine council. We've established in depth on this channel that the divine council cosmology is the oldest recoverable theological framework in the ancient Near East. So I'm not re-arguing it here, but what I keep finding was that it wasn't confined to the Near East. The same specific architecture of a presiding deity, delegated governance, and hierarchical divine authority over creation shows up in Zoroastrian theology, in the oldest Vedic texts, in the earliest layers of Egyptian cosmology, and in other traditions with no plausible Old World contact at all. For example, the divine assembly documented in the Popol Vuh, the sacred Quiché Maya text, existed in a civilization with no transmission route to Mesopotamia. Parallel evolution requires a shared stimulus, but there is no shared stimulus between ancient Sumer and pre-Columbian Mexico. The second element is the cosmic flood with a divinely chosen survivor. In the Atrahasis epic and the Epic of Gilgamesh, both predating the biblical account in written form, the flood is decreed by a divine council. A righteous man is warned by a sympathetic deity. An ark is built to specific dimensions, birds are released in sequence to find land, and the survivor offers a sacrifice upon emergence. Andrew George at the University of London documented all of this in detail, but the standard response is still that the Bible just borrowed from Mesopotamia, and the cultural contact is well documented, so that may be partly true. But it totally misses the more interesting question. Why does this specific combination of procedural details appear together at all? Flood experiences are common, but a divine council decree, a named righteous survivor, precise arc dimensions, sequential bird release, and post-emergent sacrifice is not what you would generate organically from surviving a flood. It is a remarkably specific procedural account pointing toward a common memory of a specific event. The third element is the garden. This is always a primordial sacred space of direct divine-human communion and lost through transgression. This one appeared before I was even looking for it, in places like the Sumerian Eridu Genesis, in Egyptian texts describing an original sacred precinct of the gods, in the Zoroastrian Vara, and in Indo-European mythology's memory of a golden age of direct divine-human contact. The obvious objection is that every culture that suffers invents the idea that things used to be better. That's fair, and it accounts for the general intuition. But what it doesn't account for is the specific four-part structure that keeps appearing with the garden itself: a sacred bound space, direct unmediated divine presence within it, a specific act of transgression as the mechanism of loss, and the latent possibility of restoration. Suffering tells you that things are bad, sure, but it doesn't tell you that they were once good in a sacred space, that you lost access through some specific moral failure, and that access can be theoretically recovered. The fourth element is the dying and rising mediator. Jonathan Z. Smith at the University of Chicago rightly complicated the older framework that treated dying and rising gods as a universal archetype Christianity borrowed from mystery religions. That framework was far too blunt, but what does survive his critiques is this. Across multiple ancient traditions, there is a figure whose descent into death and return from it functions as the mechanism of a cosmic restoration. Osiris, Baal, Inanna, and others, and what stays consistent is the underlying theological principle. The idea that divine mediation through death is the mechanism by which humanity's access to the divine is renewed. Now, back up for a second and think about what that means in the context of the garden thread. The garden established that humanity lost direct communion with the divine through transgression, and the dying and rising mediator is the proposed solution to that rupture. These are not simply separate coincidences. Together, they form a coherent theological system: a fall from divine communion and a divine mediator whose death and resurrection is the mechanism of restoration. That problem and solution architecture surfacing together across traditions that had no reason to arrive at the same answer was worth taking seriously, at least for me. And the fifth element is the sacred ascent ritual. We've also covered this in depth, so I'm not going to rehash that one here either, but understand that the core pattern is a structured movement through layered sacred space with specific sacred knowledge required at each threshold and culminating in a transformative divine encounter. That specific complex appears in Egyptian mortuary theology, in the Mesopotamian descent of Inanna, in the Eleusinian mysteries, and in Jewish Merkaba mysticism. Margaret Barker, the British Methodist scholar who served as president of the Society for Old Testament Study, has argued that this was the original theology of the First Temple in Jerusalem, but suppressed in the reforms of the 7th century BC, which is exactly why it survived only in fragments across these other traditions. The significance of that argument becomes even more clear when we talk about the restoration. So again, why can't all of this simply be parallel development? Because parallel evolution covers general themes considerably better than specific theological architectures. I'm not talking about the general observation that there might be multiple divine beings or the general intuition that heaven is up. I'm talking about a structured hierarchical divine assembly with delegated governance, and a specific ritual complex with layered cosmic architecture, threshold guardians, required sacred knowledge at each level, and initiatory transformation. Those are not the kind of things that parallel evolution would generate cleanly on its own. And the divergence in the details with the convergence in the structure is actually the signature of common origin, and exactly what you would predict from a tradition that was transmitted independently across thousands of years of cultural development. So at what point did following this trail stop being an intellectual exercise and start pointing somewhere specific? Well, it didn't happen at a single moment. What happened gradually was that my prior assumption was basically dismantled. The whole assumption that ancient religious traditions are essentially isolated inventions, that the similarities are superficial, and that serious investigation will eventually reveal independent origins with no meaningful common thread. The further I went, the less defensible that assumption became. Once that assumption was gone, the question was simply what framework actually makes sense of what the evidence shows. The conceptual tool that gave me the most traction came from an Egyptologist, Jan Assmann at the University of Konstanz, who developed the concept of cultural memory, the idea that certain foundational experiences get encoded in ritual and narrative and transmitted across very long timescales, remaining structurally recognizable even as the specific cultural content changes. He was simply describing a mechanism that he observed in the historical record. But what he described is exactly what you would expect to find if a common original tradition had fragmented and had been carried in pieces across the ancient world. Cultural memory explains how a tradition transmits itself over time, but it doesn't by itself tell you where it originated. What gives you the directionality is the geographic distribution of the specific architectural combinations. Structural consistency across traditions that were geographically isolated from each other, including pre-Columbian cultures with no Old World contact, is consistent with a single fragmented source, and inconsistent with independent parallel development, which would produce far more architectural diversity than the record shows. And here is the real key to why cognitive universals don't actually resolve this. If universal human psychology explained the architecture, then isolated traditions should converge on all theological questions at roughly the same time. But, of course, they don't. The convergence is selective. It's specifically concentrated in these 5 structural elements rather than distributed evenly across all religious questions. Selective convergence on specific elements is not the signature of common cognition, but rather common transmission. The LDS claim is that the original tradition existed. One revelation given beginning with Adam, fragmented globally as humanity scattered, preserved in varying degrees of clarity across all ancient traditions, and restored in fullness in the 19th century. That is, in fact, a specific testable framework, and testability in a historical argument means making a prediction that could actually be falsified. So, the LDS thesis predicts that the 5 structural elements should appear not only in traditions connected by documented contact routes, but also in traditions geographically isolated from the Old World entirely. If the convergence were confined to the contact routes, then diffusion would be the sufficient explanation, and the common origin thesis would be in some trouble. So the fact that the divine council appears in the Popol Vuh, that a sacred garden narrative appears in pre-Columbian cosmology, and that flood traditions with divinely chosen survivors appear in Pacific Island cultures with no plausible Mesopotamian contact, is showing the prediction passing rather than failing. So the thesis holds where it could have been falsified. What stayed with me personally was that the theological framework preserved in the Book of Mormon, like the pre-Deuteronomistic theology that Lehi carried out of Jerusalem, is the same framework that I kept encountering in the ancient Near Eastern and comparative literature. Again, the divine council, the sacred ascent, the premortal existence of souls, and the covenant mediated through a specific divine figure. The opening chapter of 1st Nephi describes Lehi's prophetic vision where he sees the heavens open, sees God on his throne, surrounded by a vast assembly, which is explicit council language, and a presiding deity with a divine assembly, which is all the oldest recoverable theological structure in the ancient Near East. That same description appears in a record that claims to have left Jerusalem in 600 BC, 21 years after Josiah's reform had begun, suppressing exactly that theology from the official Israelite record. It's either a remarkable coincidence or it's exactly what you'd expect from a record that actually predates the reform. And how does the pattern hold across different traditions that are more geographically remote? Let's address the scholarship first. The traditionalist or perennialist school, associated with scholars like René Guénon, Friedhof Schuon, and Houston Smith of MIT and Syracuse, argued that the world's religious traditions are not competing independent inventions, but all expressions of a single underlying primordial truth. It's a minority position in academic religious studies, but I want to be exact about what that really means. What is the minority is just the interpretation. The data, however, is not. The structural parallels that the perennialist school observes are documented independently by mainstream scholars who don't share their conclusion at all, like Barker, Jacobson, and Assmann, working from entirely different methodological frameworks. You are free to reject the perennialist conclusion, but you still have to account for what their data shows. Also, Joseph Campbell documented structural parallels across mythologies regardless of cultural contact. Now, his explanation was psychological, drawing on Jung, saying that the patterns reflect universal structures of the human psyche. That itself is coherent, but it has a small problem. If the similarities reflect universal psychology, then they should be structurally uniform in proportion to how universal the psychological experience really is. But the sacred ascent ritual with its specific threshold knowledge is not at all a universal psychological structure, the way that the hero journey broadly is. It's way too specific, too elaborate, and appearing in combinations that are way too particular to be explained by Jungian archetypes. The specific patterns here are doing most of the work in this argument, but Campbell handles the general pattern. Now, let's address the geographic reach. The connection between ancient India and the Near East runs through the proto-Indo-European language family, which is the common ancestor of Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Persian, and most of our European languages. Now, the Vedic concept of Rita, the cosmic order underlying both natural and moral law. Rita just happens to be structurally cognate with the Egyptian Mot and Zoroastrianism Asha as well. So at least 3 different civilizations with 3 different words, but describing the same underlying theological concept of a divinely established order governing both the cosmos and human behavior simultaneously. Zoroastrianism sits at an interesting intersection of these worlds. Among the oldest continuously practiced religions on Earth, Zoroastrianism became the official religion of the entire Persian Empire, meaning that it was the dominant religious culture surrounding the Jewish community during the Babylonian exile, the very period when scholars like Frank Moore Cross have argued significant portions of the Hebrew Bible were being compiled and edited. You just can't honestly reconstruct that intellectual environment without it. And, of course, the theological overlaps with Second Temple Judaism, like resurrection, final judgment, cosmic dualism, and eschatology, are well documented and uncontroversial. Mary Boyce, who held the chair in Iranian Studies at the University of London, has also documented these aspects of Zoroastrianism at length. A critic could correctly note that these overlaps are explained by documented cultural contact, because the Jewish community was in fact inside the Persian Empire for generations. I understand that. But Zoroastrianism doesn't only connect forward to Judaism, it also connects backward towards the Vedic traditions and even sideways toward the divine council structures of Mesopotamia and Canaan. The Amesha Spentas, who are the holy immortals that govern different domains of creation under Ahura Mazda, are also structurally cognate with divine council figures across the ancient Near East. Zoroastrianism simply illustrates the connectivity between worlds. The isolated pre-Columbian traditions illustrate that something is being preserved beyond what that connectivity alone can explain. But both legs of that argument actually matter. What about the Masonry objection that always comes up? What makes the LDS case specifically defensible, and where does all this leave someone who doesn't accept the LDS conclusion? Let's handle these in sequence because they actually build on each other. For Masonry, the timing is the first obstacle, of sorts. Joseph became a Freemason in 1842, and he introduced the temple ceremony the same year. Now, the similarity in certain elements is really there, and pretending otherwise would not be an honest engagement. But here's where this objection actually takes us. Freemasonry itself claims ancient origins. They claim that it preserves elements of Solomon's temple ritual transmitted through medieval stonemason guilds. Most scholars of Masonry are skeptical that the institution is as old as it presents itself, but the elements in Masonic ritual that parallel the LDS endowment are actually the elements that Masonry attributes to the ancient temple ritual, not actually the things that Masonry invented on its own. So, if Joseph borrowed those elements from Masonry, then the question of where Masonry got them still remains entirely open. When Margaret Barker independently documents First Temple theology in the pre-exilic Hebrew sources and describes elements that parallel both Masonic tradition and the LDS endowment, the borrowed from Masonry explanation becomes considerably more complicated. In her work, Barker concretely documents a theology of sacred garments as markers of divine status and covenant access, garments that were part of the investiture ritual of the First Temple priesthood, but stripped away in the reforms following Josiah. That same element appears in Masonic ritual attributed to Solomonic origins, and it appears in the LDS endowment. Barker documented it in the ancient Hebrew sources before she ever had any engagement with LDS theology. So, you would need to explain why all three of these independently converge on the same specific ritual element if the explanation is simply that Joseph copied the Masons. And the answer that some shared Renaissance esoteric intermediary could account for both Masonry and the LDS endowment doesn't really resolve the problem either. Because Barker documented the sacred garment theology specifically in the pre-exilic Hebrew sources, which is material that predates any Renaissance esoteric tradition by more than 2,000 years. There is no intermediary required between Joseph and an ancient original because Barker found the ancient original through entirely independent research. So, the more coherent reading of this is that all three traditions, the ancient Hebrew priesthood, Masonic ritual, and the LDS endowment, are drawing from the same source at different levels of proximity and clarity. Now let's talk about how defensible the LDS position is. The distinction that matters for this is between vague appeals to ancient wisdom and specific falsifiable claims checkable against independent evidence. For example, Theosophy claimed access to ancient wisdom and produced claims unconnectable to any verifiable ancient sources, like when Blavatsky's Lemuria rested primarily on the geographic distribution of lemurs, which plate tectonics have since explained. But the LDS can make specific claims. The Book of Mormon claims to preserve a scriptural tradition from people who left Jerusalem around 600 BC before the Deuteronomistic reforms were complete. That is a checkable claim. Barker's First Temple theology describes the pre-reform framework in ways that match exactly what the Book of Mormon preserves, including the sacred garment theology that I just mentioned. Cross's work establishes the 621 BC date of Josiah's reform and documents the systematic suppression of pre-exilic theological elements, namely the divine council, the heavenly intermediary theology, and the anointing traditions, which is precisely the material that Lehi's group would have carried. And Tov's textual criticism establishes that the Masoretic text is a later standardized tradition that eliminated readings preserved in earlier manuscripts. The Book of Mormon's Isaiah quotations in several places align with those earlier traditions rather than the Masoretic text that Joseph Smith had access to. One example in 2 Nephi chapter 12 verse 16 includes the phrase, "and upon all the ships of the sea," absent from the King James Version but present in the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation produced centuries before the Masoretic standardization. None of these scholars were trying to corroborate Joseph Smith. The corroboration is just a byproduct of their work. And as for Hinduism and Kabbalah, those traditions still preserve fragments of something real, and that preservation also has value. but they are also not making the same specific historical claim about the same specific timeline and the same specific textual tradition. The convergence argument that I've just laid out establishes the plausibility of the general framework, but the specific historical corroboration is what distinguishes the LDS claim within that framework. And so, where does this leave someone who doesn't accept the LDS conclusion? Of course, you can look at this evidence and reach a different conclusion. The ancient convergence does not by itself establish that the LDS restoration is the correct framework. That's not the claim. What the claim establishes is that the LDS framework is consistent with what the ancient record shows, and that the common critique of Joseph Smith making up theological content is not actually supported by that record. What is even considerably harder to maintain honestly is the position that the convergence does not exist at all, and that Joseph Smith invented the exact theological content that comparative scholars spent the 20th century finding in the ancient record. When the critique of the LDS Church rests on this picture, then that picture is actually working against the available evidence. You are definitely entitled to your own explanation for the pattern, but an explanation that ignores this pattern is not really engaging with the evidence. At what point do we step back and ask where that picture came from in the first place and whether it's doing the work that you think it is? There is a specific case that I want to talk through in the near future as a follow-up to this video. It's about a prophet that is quoted at length in the Book of Mormon, but who does not appear anywhere in the surviving Old Testament, and again, whose theology maps with very neat precision onto pre-exilic Israelite patterns that scholars didn't even begin to document until the 20th century. The argument will get considerably more specific from here, but for this episode and for now, I want to end where I personally ended. All of this evidence took me to a door, but the last step that I needed to take was not an intellectual one. And when the evidence became overwhelming and I humbled myself enough, I eventually decided to take that step. So let me bring this all together in a quick summary. Across Sumerian, Babylonian, Canaanite, Egyptian, Zoroastrian, Vedic, Greek, and Jewish mystical traditions, the same 5 structural elements appear: a divine council governing the cosmos through delegated authority, a catastrophic flood with a divinely chosen survivor, a primordial garden of divine human communion lost through transgression, a dying and rising mediator who functions as the mechanism of cosmic restoration, and a sacred ascent ritual requiring sacred knowledge at each threshold. This all happens in combinations that are too specific and in traditions too geographically dispersed to be adequately explained by simple parallel evolution or selective borrowing. The scholars who documented them, like Eliade, Barker, Jacobson, Assmann, Boyce, George, Smith, and many others not mentioned today, were not out there collaborating on an LDS apologetic project. The convergence is just a byproduct of their independent work, not the intention. And finally, the LDS restoration offers the best available explanation. There was one original revelation, given beginning with Adam, fragmented globally across the dispersal of human civilization, preserved in varying degrees of clarity in all ancient traditions, and reassembled in fullness in the 19th century. To the LDS members watching, what you actually believe is older than the very traditions that criticize it. The 5 structural elements that I described today are not innovations that Joseph Smith introduced. They existed in the oldest recoverable religious material on Earth, and it's been documented by non-LDS scholars who are not trying to confirm them. When critics say that the church just borrows from ancient traditions, the accurate answer is yes, but in the sense that it recovers these traditions. That is the entire claim of the restoration. That's the whole point. To the critics and skeptics, you don't have to accept the LDS conclusion, but there is a version of the critique of Joseph Smith that wants you to treat him as an inventor of theological content that wasn't actually available to him. But that version is not at all consistent with what the comparative record actually shows. If the framework you're working from only works when you ignore evidence rather than engage with it, then you should take a step back for a second, because you're not being intellectually honest about the evidence. And to people who are just learning about this, what the LDS Church claims at its foundation is that God revealed himself to humanity from the very beginning, that those revelations were fragmented and partially lost, and that they were then recovered through a prophet in the 19th century. The ancient convergence that I've described today is exactly what that claim predicts that you would find if all of that were true. I just encourage you to follow the evidence directly. Please read the scholars in the pinned comment rather than taking my word for it, and go wherever that leads with honesty and with the power of prayer. That's all I did. I followed the facts, and it took me somewhere that I would have never expected to end up. So, please check out all of my sources in the pinned comments below. I'm Alex Arnold, and this is Moroni's Standard.